Sound.
Thank you. Bonjour, good morning. Mon nom est Eliza Watt.
Good morning. I'm the director of the Norman Patter School of International Affairs.
Another edition of the Year Ahead Conference. J'aimerais vous souhaiter à tous et à toutes la bienvenue.
I'd like to welcome you all to this conference.
Great one, so it's great that some of you can be at the Canadian War Museum, while others are also able to join remotely. Congratulations to my colleague, Professor Steve Seidman, and his team for continuing the tradition of hosting this annual conference every December for the last 7 years. The objective of the Year Ahead Conference, as originally conceived, is to provide an opportunity for experts from academia and the public sector to have a conversation about international security challenges that the Canadian government and its closest allies are likely to face. As in previous years, we again have a great agenda to look forward to. Topics will include gray zone warfare, organizational change, domestic operations, Islamophobia, and national security. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all the sponsors who have made today's conference possible, in particular, Faculty of Public Affairs at Carleton University, SHERC, and other granting agencies who have supported us in the past few years. Thank you very much. I wish you all a good conference. Merci et bonne conférence.
Thanks, Teddy. Good morning et bienvenue. I am Stephen Seidman, Director of the Canadian Defense and Security Network, Patterson Chair, International Affairs, and the co-host of the Battle Rhythm podcast with Stephanie Von Lackey, who will be with us later on today. Welcome to the Year Ahead 2022. The idea of this conference is always to give a glimpse to the problems and challenges facing Canada and its allies in the near horizon. And we've been living in very challenging times the past few years. And so we consult with our partners in and out of government about the topics that concern them most. And so we're very excited to have an in-person event as well as an online event this time around. So it's a hybrid. It's one of the first in-person events that I can think of since the pandemic started. We're hoping that this is part of a transition to normalcy, although obviously with a new variant, we don't really know what future lies ahead of us until we understand that variant a little bit better. But we're looking forward to having this event today, and we're looking forward to getting participants both from the audience here and online to ask us questions so that we can have a dynamic conversation about not just the things that are facing us, but how should we best respond to it. It is no secret that the global health crisis has affected us all in profound ways. It's upended the way we interact with our families. It has changed the way we work. It has greatly challenged the government in a myriad of ways, from getting the original protective gear out to the people, to helping remote communities, to getting the vaccine out, and now to getting the vaccine out again and again. The security, intelligence, and security landscapes were no exception to all of this. We saw the Canadian Armed Forces be part of the rollout of the vaccine. We saw them flying refrigerators up to the northern parts of Canada because the Pfizer vaccine was very sensitive to temperature. So we've all been affected by this crisis. For the year ahead, we're focused on a few key challenges that we've identified, again, with our partners. How to respond to the challenges of Russia, China, and other authoritarian regimes that aren't war, but aren't not war either. This gray zone where our adversaries are using our values, our democracy, and our way of life against us in ways that are asymmetrical, that it doesn't cost them a whole lot to do these things, but it can have traumatic impacts on us. So we're going to have two panels dedicated to that, one focusing on the legal gray areas that are created by this. The second panel will be on learning from how our allies have responded to this, because we're not the only ones facing this crisis or these attacks. We're also going to have a panel on changing the culture of organizations. And we say organizations in general, but there's a couple that we have specifically in mind that the pandemic has overlapped a lot with the crisis the Canadian Armed Forces have faced in its leadership with regard to sexual misconduct, with regard to the abuse of power. And there's been a lot of discussion of cultural change and organizational change, but we don't really know we don't really have really good grasp of that, or at least we outsiders. So we've brought in a group of people who study this stuff and have perspectives on what are some steps we can take to try to make changes, both in the short run and in the long run. We also have a panel on domestic emergencies and how to respond to them. One of the surprises I've learned over the past couple of years is that the understanding of domestic emergency operations has been quite segmented, that those folks who study Canadian defense and security haven't really been engaged in domestic operations. That is, they haven't studied it the way that people who actually do emergency operations. There's a community of scholars who do this kind of work, but they've been kind of disconnected from conventional defense scholars. So we're bringing those people to us to get a perspective, because General Eyre noted before he became Chief of Defense Staff, was Army Chief, that these domestic emergencies are challenging us more and more all the time, and we've got to figure out how to do this not on an ad hoc basis, but to actually develop a better understanding, better preparation, and figure out what are the challenges in the future. As the floods in British Columbia last week remind us, climate change is here to stay. We can be fighting climate change in a variety of ways, but the effects of it are going to be felt. And one of the automatic go-to organizations we reach out for help is the Canadian Armed Forces. And we also have a special panel on Islamophobia and national security, that with our partner, Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security Canada, we've brought together some people to address this challenge of how fear of Muslims, hate, has caused us to really harm our national security, that national security is not just for government agencies, but it's for the entire Canadian public. And our concern about the war and terrorism over the past 20 years has rebounded upon a certain part of Canada in ways that have been quite destructive. And so we're going to have our fireside chat's going to focus on that issue today. I want to thank the War Museum for hosting this event. This has been a challenge for them because they haven't had a whole lot of events in this context. I'm very happy and proud that we are continuing with our event today, despite the fact that we face the pandemic. I want to thank Haji Mohammed, who is our project coordinator at the CDSN and the director of CSIDS. She's done a great job of building the program and working with the War Museum, the AV people, the translators, and all the rest to deliver the conference. I'm very grateful to Melissa Jennings, who is utterly indispensable, who is the CDSN's director of communications, who advertised the event ahead of time, and she's going to do a lot of the heavy lifting afterwards to get the content online and distribute it in a variety of ways. We have a great team of research assistants, Paxton Mayer, Rachel Wallace, Gabrielle and Rose, who have done a great amount of work leading up to this event and helping make this day work well. We're thankful to the SHIRK Partnership Grant for funding my staff, to Carleton for funding our graduate students, to the Department of National Defense's Mines Program for funding the conference itself. Throughout the day, we're going to have presentations in person and from people who couldn't make it. So we'll have a mixture of online presentations and in-person ones. Our audience as well is going to be both online and in person. We're going to try to include both audiences in our Q&A. There are microphones here and there for the people in person, and online you should be able to use the interface to ask questions, and we should be able to see them, and the moderators will direct the questions to the audience, to the speakers. If you have challenges, you can email info@cdsn-rcds.com. That's info@cdsn-rcds.com. If you're having technical problems, or if you want to send questions to us as well. I will not be live tweeting as energetically as I'm known to do so, as I will be busy trying to keep track of the event itself. But you can use the hashtag YearAhead2022 to continue the conversation online. With the help of the experts we will hear from today and from the engagement from those watching online, we can exchange perspectives, share research ideas and strategies, and most importantly, try to figure out some solutions to these problems. We hope that eventually this program will be online and also on TV. We want to acknowledge that Carleton University, as well as this location, is located on unceded Algonquin territory, which is home to the Anishinaabe Nation. We've provided simultaneous translation online. We have 2 different YouTube channels, one in French and one in English. We have closed captioning as well, and there are devices outside if you need to have translation. If there are any technical issues with anything today, you can also reach out to Kaha Haji Muhammad. Her email address is Kaha, Kaha Haji, Haji, hyphen Muhammad, Mohamed, at cunet.carleton.ca. Finally, for some housekeeping, we are still in the middle of a pandemic, so we must follow COVID rules, which means that when you're walking around, you should be wearing masks. You can get the food from the side for the breaks. The lunch will be served directly to you. There will not be a buffet. You can obviously get up and walk around, but when you do so, please put your mask back on and keep the usual distances. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Lea West. She's an assistant professor at the Patterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. She will be moderating the first panel, and I believe all three of our speakers will be online as they're coming from Europe. So I look forward to hearing from what they have to say about the legal challenges of the gray zone. Thank you. Thank you, Leah.
Hello. Oh, there they are. Hi, everyone. So it's really my pleasure to be here today, and I want to start by just explaining, so the term gray space is used often when we talk about techniques, strategies, etc. But when we're talking about the law that applies in the gray space, we usually use the term below threshold. And so that, what we mean by that, and because you'll hear it probably a lot, is activities that fall below the use of force threshold that are therefore not governed around the laws of the use of force or use in bello, or armed conflict. So they are not an armed conflict or an armed attack. So they're not governed by what we call use ad bellum or international humanitarian law or the law of war. So it's activities that, as we know, create havoc, create significant consequences, but aren't governed by these two sets of laws that we typically associate with action with that kind of destructive capability. So the law around the use of force in armed conflict is highly developed. There are treaties we can look to that set out the law, as well as customary international law. But operations that fall below this space are still subject to much legal debate. And to explore that debate, I'm thrilled to be joined today by literally some of the world's leading experts on cyber operations and international laws. Starting first with Dr. François Delerue, who is a senior researcher in cybersecurity governance at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs in Leiden University. He's also a team leader of international law project at EU Cyber Direct. He's an associate fellow at the Hague Program for Cyber Norms and previously worked as a research fellow in cyber defense and international law at the Institute for Strategic Research of the French Ministry of Defense. His book, titled Cyber Operations and International Law, was published in Cambridge University by Cambridge University Press in February 2020 and has been at my side ever since. Second, we have Dr. Asaf Lubin, who is an associate professor of law at Indiana University Moore School of Law and a fellow at IU's Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research. He's additionally affiliated as an affiliated fellow with Yale Law School's Information Society Project, a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet Society at Harvard University, a visiting scholar at Hebrew University of Jerusalem Fetterman Cybersecurity Research Center. Dr. Lubin's research centers around the intersection of law, technology, particularly as it relates to the regulation of cybersecurity harms, liabilities, and insurance, as well as cyber policy design. And his work draws on his experience as a former intelligence analyst with the IDF, the intelligence branch, as well as his vast practical training and expertise in national security law, and foreign policy. Basically, you can't read anything on this subject without him being cited or mentioned. And then we have Dr. Eliza Watt, whose research focuses on cyber law and human rights. She is the author of a book titled State-Sponsored Cyber Surveillance, The Right to Privacy of Communications and International Law. Her work has been published in a number of peer-reviewed journals and other publications. She's contributed to the UN Office of Disarmament Affairs 2017 study titled Non-Binding Norms for Responsible State Behavior in the Use of Information and Communications Technology. And she's also a lawyer. She's a guest speaker at the College of Information and Cyberspace, National Defense University at Washington, D.C. And she is a lawyer in the UK. So today, rather than presenting papers, what we're going to do is a bit different. I'm going to ask all of the panelists a series of questions for which they are prepared, and we're going to build a dialogue from there, and then we'll open things up to a broader Q&A, just to keep things a little bit more dynamic, and because I want to have a conversation with these folks about legal authorities in the gray space. I was really hoping they'd come to Ottawa. Okay, so to get things kicked off, we were going to start with Professor Lubin. I have a question for you. Why should states care about if and how international law governs below-threshold cyber operations? Can and will the law actually ever serve as a deterrent for states operating in this space? And should we really worry about deterring them at all? I turn it to you, Professor Lubin.
Thank you so much, Leah, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak here today. I'm sorry that I'm not there in person. I'm actually in New York celebrating my first-year marriage anniversary, but I did not want to miss this opportunity, so my partner excuses me and allows me to indulge in being here today. This topic is one of importance predominantly from how timely it is. What we've witnessed in the past few years is a growing reliance on cyber tools to engage what was traditionally done through kinetic warfare. We now rely on cyber surveillance as well as other more offensive cyber operations to collect information about our adversaries, to send signals that are not done through kinetic means, and to really create a secret environment, not one that is public, where messages cross and various kinds of political interests are achieved. And it is in that space that we should ask the question, what, if anything, should be deterred, right? That's the question that was posed. For the audience, I want to suggest an article, an opinion piece that was published in the New York Times in August by Sibel Greenberg, titled, "Could Cyber War Make the World Safer?" And what she argues in that piece is that we should be cautioned not to suggest that every element of what is colloquially coined cyber warfare is necessarily a bad thing. The example she gives there is the Israeli attack on the nuclear reactor in Syria in 2007, in which 10 allegedly, though no public information was ever released, allegedly 10 North Korean scientists were killed. And she compares that to the Stuxnet incident, which by itself, from a legal perspective, can open a lot of doors. Is Stuxnet even below or above the threshold? That's part of the problem, that the threshold itself is not sufficiently defined. But she gives the Stuxnet example to demonstrate here, achieving the same political goals, the countries involved, allegedly Israel and the United States, were able to take down or significantly hinder the Natanz nuclear enrichment lab without killing anyone. So to the extent that we're able to achieve certain political goals, in this case, international non-proliferation, without causing kinetic consequences, could that be a good thing and not necessarily a bad thing? And so the question that we should all kind of pose and ask is, where do we draw the lines of deterrence in the below the threshold space? And what are the kind of activities that we do want to see deterred, and therefore we do want to see regulations that help shape that deterrence, compared to other activities which we might not want to see deterred, and we actually might want to even incentivize states to engage in. And I think that that has been a big challenge for states. States have had an easier time regulating what we've colloquially called the above the threshold space, in part because it's easier to set a prohibition on the use of force and just move forward with that prohibition. When we move to dual use technologies, When we move to activities that are in that space of non-intervention and infringements on sovereignty, that is precisely where regulation becomes tricky, because you don't want to set the net too wide to over-capture things that you don't necessarily want to deter. So that's kind of the first part of the answer I wanted to offer. I'll just mention one second half of it. Even if we kind of want to move forward in that conversation, we'll have a lot of different elements that make regulation particularly challenging here. The first is the challenge of accountability in a space where attribution is extremely difficult and fraught. And so our rules of attribution, which have been with us for decades, might have not been kind of crossed the threshold into a digital universe in which attribution can be augmented through the use of various kinds of spoofing tools and anonymizing techniques. Similarly, cyberspace is also a space that allows the move from state actors as primary actors to non-state actors having the same access and capabilities as some nation states. And this could be multinational corporations on the one side, but it can also be criminal gangs in the ransomware context. So how do we set regulations that arrest both kinds of actors in that space is open for debate. The third issue is unintended consequences. Cyber operations, below the threshold cyber operations, have more ability to spill over and cause disproportionate effects that were not intended by the players. And so what was presumably a non-kinetic operation might end up being kinetic if we use tools that are in a reckless way or that do not take into account particular consequences. And then the last thing I'll mention is the secrecy surrounding this. So cyber operations involve intelligence agencies at a greater degree as primary actors in this space. The operations are not disclosed to the public. There's a lot of activity that is ongoing that is not subject to transparency. And so how do we address this kind of space that obviously involves all kinds of secret secondary rules, administrative rules, regulatory agency rules over which we have no public debate and control. So that's where I'll stop to start us off. I hope I've been provocative enough to kind of carry the conversation forward.
So perhaps I'll start and see if Professor Delerue has anything to say maybe on the issue of attribution. I saw you nodding and you write about this in your book, or Dr. Watt, if you have anything you want to jump in on, but I'll turn it to Professor Delerue first to see your response.
Good morning, good afternoon here in Europe. Thank you very much for the invitation. I just wanted to say at the beginning in French that merci beaucoup aux organisateurs.
Thank you very much to the organizers for allowing me to speak French. I would prefer to do my presentation in English so that we could have a better dialogue, but thank you very much for this opportunity.
Turning back to English. I think on this first question, and what are the main issue, mainly with the question of also with the question of attribution, is one of the issues is we have a set of rules that were developed before, and we try to adapt them to this very specific context. But most of the time, what is interesting is we are actually trying to find answers to questions that are not legal questions. And for me, that's one of the main issues we have with cyber today is for a lot of questions you will hear or you will read, actually also in academics works, that international law is not providing a sufficient answer or international law is not providing an answer. But then when you read the problems that is listed after, the question is not a legal question. So for example, on the question of attribution, which is one of the very big topics, as you mentioned before, we always have this debate on, yeah, but we cannot attribute, yes, but you cannot attribute not, because the law does not give you any title to say this person is related to that state. You cannot attribute because you cannot find the evidences, which is not a legal question. So I think it's always kind of the step backs. I think it's interesting to have on this question, and on this question on below the threshold is there are different rules, there are different, we will come back in the discussion on that, I'm sure, but there are different rules that apply below the threshold. It's just they might not be satisfactory, they might not provide a satisfactory answer. Then the question is, can the law provide a satisfactory answer? Because maybe the answer you look for is outside of the legal framework.
Great, thank you. Dr. Watt.
Hello, and thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting discussion. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, I have two points to make in relation to this. So the first is how international law governs below the threshold operations. I think first issue to actually highlight is what is the threshold against which we are going to be actually gauging the gravity of a particular operation. So are we talking about the sort of threshold that applies to the jus ad bellum qualifications, or is it the sort of threshold that applies, for example, to the breach of general principles of international law, such as, for example, sovereignty? So I think this, in the first place, is something that we need to establish. In other words, it really is not well defined in international law what are below the threshold operations. So this is something that I actually wanted to talk about anyway later in my presentation. And I think I take the point that Asaf has made earlier. In that, obviously, attribution is it's a huge concern, and it's one of the most important aspects of international law at present. In other words, how do we legally actually attribute an action of a state or a proxy in order then to be able to respond to that particular action within the legal parameters? Again, my presentation, and I have a presentation on the topic, hopefully will address these issues in more detail. I have actually prepared some slides, so my presentation is more structured, and I hope I will be able to use that, but I am very much looking forward to addressing that very point. In other words, the point of attribution is something that I had picked up on when preparing for this, and I just don't want to repeat myself. So hopefully, when I come to discuss my question, I will all of that will become more transparent.
Great, so then I'll ask the second question to Professor Delerue then, unless Professor Lubin, you wanted to jump in response. So Professor Delerue, are wrongful acts carried out in cyberspace somehow different than wrongful acts carried out wholly in the physical world? Why is the international community struggling, and we've talked about some of the reasons why, to clarify how the law applies in cyberspace? And I think you'll probably expand maybe on some of your points that you've just made, but I'll turn it to you.
Thank you very much, Leah. Yeah, I think I had the same problem than Eliza. You want to say so many things for the first question, but that you don't want to go too much on what you for the rest, and to put some other answers. I think so. What is very interesting with these two questions, and I will start with the second one, is, are they really struggling? And for me, that's part of the question, is, are the states really struggling to define the legal framework? And what I want to say here, what I want to highlight is the first resolution on cyber at the UN, the first on is international security related to cyber, was adopted in 1999, so 22 years ago. Over 22 years, actually, they had quite a very dynamic debate. They have created working groups on everything. As international lawyers, we know that international law is maybe the slowest thing on earth. So 22 years to have this kind of debate and already having kind of first ground discussion on the content of norms, I'm not sure I would qualify it struggling compared to what we saw on some treaty-making process, like the law of the same processes that took more than 50 years to arrive to a conference. So for me, that's kind of the first point, and I always kind of like to recall that mainly when I'm teaching, actually, because yeah, so students ask you this kind of question, and you're like, yeah, but compared to the rest of the international security and international community, we talk about a very short time frame, which had success, which had failure. And I wanted to move on one of the failure, which for me is also very important on this question of struggling, which is, so the UN established, the UN member states through the first committee, the Committee on Peace and Security, established a group of governmental experts. So a group of experts will be meeting and working on these questions. The first one failed because of international law, actually, and also the fifth one. One of the questions we'll always see is on what was said is a group of states, for the last one was Russia, China, and Cuba, blocked the report saying that they don't want to see in the final report self-defense, the law on countermeasure, and the law of armed conflict being kind of enshrined in it. because that would be kind of a justification for the militarization of cyberspace. Well, I disagree with this affirmation. I'm not the only one. I think it's something very common in the literature. But what is interesting is the way that was perceived. Because the way that was perceived is this country are actually going against the international legal framework, or like there is a problem on the international legal framework. But what is clear from other discussion and what is clear for what has been following up is it was not a contestation of international law. And this is also very important, I think, to frame in the discussion is, it was not saying that they don't want international law to apply. What they didn't want is to have these specific branches of international law detailed in the report. They made other declaration relating to use of force and self-defense. For example, Russia made this kind of declaration. So that's also for me another point to say in struggling. There is struggling on maybe defining the legal framework, but there are also a lot of this kind of struggles, failure, or other like events, let's say, that just may be related to the political context and maybe related to where this discussion takes place. And I think it's very important. So we have a very dynamic debate, and I think that's what we can say. The UN has been very dynamic. All international organizations today work on cyber. You have discussion on international law on cyber, like for international lawyer, it's a dream. You have these questions popping everywhere. You have questions everywhere. We have now states, we have certain states that have published a strategy on how international law apply in cyberspace. We have this summer, the UN that released a compendium where 15 states, including some of the 13 previous states, but have released their views on how international apply in cyberspace. So I think, yes, there is some struggle, but there is also a lot of dynamism. And we see like this kind of slow ship, let's say, or iceberg, if you want to compare it to an iceberg, slowly moving and something is happening. Where I wanted to go with that and what I wanted to highlight is what we see from the discussion, from what we see in the papers, in the strategy and so forth, is actually states tend to converge in their view. There are some specific points on which they are divergent. Sovereignty is a big one. I think Asaf also has a lot of points to say on sovereignty. But still, there is a high degree of convergence, and that's very interesting. The other point which is important, there is no contestation of international law in general. There may be some debate on specific interpretations. The UK has a very creative approach to sovereignty, for example, but still, you don't have like contestation of entire branches of international law for now. So I think that's something interesting, which leads me to the last question. So which one, your first question, sorry, but why states and are wrongful acts carried in cyberspace somehow different? And I think that's a very important thing, because when you think about these rules and when you think about this question of struggling, why do we need to define them when we talk about cyber? Why we never did that outside of cyberspace? So for example, there is this rule defining like customary rule, and you have also then some treaties, but a state should not violate the territorial sovereignty of another state. But we never defined really clearly what does it mean. We never adopted a treaty saying that 1 foot crossing the border is fine too. No, it's not, you know. So it's a bit also what I find very interesting is there is this question that in cyberspace, we tend to be willing, and states mainly, also academics because we really like to have these debates, but mainly states tend to really want to define everything very clearly. Same thing with the use of force. We have Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, we have customary international law, which is even less defined, saying that, okay, you should not use force between states. But we never really define what is the content of force. And then we have this debate here on cyber that we want to have a red line saying that that number of computers destroyed, maybe that's a line. So, which lead me to ask the question, why we have this difference, why we want to have this kind of precisions in cyberspace. And the reason is because we are moving with cyber from an exceptional circumstances system with something that is very exceptional in the mobilization and the use of the norms, of the rules and principle of international law, to a daily experience. A military airplane of a foreign country breaching into the border of another country, it's not happening every day. Like an unlawful violation of airspace is not something happening every day. A territorial violation on land is something that is happening twice a year, 3 times a year, maybe more, but not that often. Cyberspace, it's every day. Every day you have breaches of international laws through cyber acts by one state against other states. And you have examples all the time. And I think this is where it's very interesting and what is different is we tend to use a legal framework that has been built to regulate something that is exceptional, and at the end, the answer is more political than legal, to something that become an everyday experience, and where you need something that would be maybe closer, or you expect something that will be working more closely to domestic law, something that is more defined with categories and everything. But it's just not what we built the international legal system on. So for me, that's what is interesting with what we see. And the last point on that is where it's actually changing a lot is the line between what will be an international wrongful act and what will be another type of act is way thinner in cyberspace, if not completely blurred. And one of the, like, with use of force, for example, we have the very good book of Olivier Courtin that discussed, it exists in French and English, that's why I'm using this example, but which discuss actually these examples of what is a police operation, what is the use of force? And you have sometimes this difficulty to define where is the border between the two. But in cyberspace, it's even blurred. Like you have a lot of operations, police operations, that you will not think that they might also constitute violation of national law, namely violation of sovereignty, for example, because police will penetrate servers located abroad to collect data, to collect evidences, and so forth. So I think it's also why you have this very big question today on what is different in cyberspace and why we need and why we are struggling at the end to define really the legal framework is you have all these questions that are appearing, and you have the fact that before maybe the military and a few other services may be able to breach international law. Today, kind of every services of a state, from the police, from the tax office, and so forth, may be breaching international law through different type of acts. So that's, I think, create a lot of questions. And yeah, that would be my answer to these two questions. Sorry, I've been a bit long.
No, that was fantastic. Thank you. Just to get my regular plug in, Professor Delerue noted that many states have made public statements about how they view the interpretation of international law, especially around this issue of sovereignty and below threshold operations. And that's really, really important for the development of international law and for us to even understand how our own domestic law is applied, because we have to interpret our domestic laws consistent with international law. Canada, unlike all of its allies, has not made any such statement. I have no idea, as someone who studies Canadian domestic security law and Canadian application of the law internationally, how Canada interprets the law around cyberspace and international law and how it sees its limitations. So if any of you work at GAC, you can remind them that I'm still waiting. Professor Lubin, I know one of your interest areas lately is the issue of ransomware, and I think maybe this might be a way we're talking about how are things different and why should we care. And I think ransomware is one of those excellent examples of something that's starting to happen every day. It's no longer exceptional. So I just invite you to speak to that.
Sure. Let me just say, I sign off on everything Professor Delerue just said. So I think that everything he said is spot on and highlights precisely the challenge that states face in trying to regulate a moving target like cyber regulation, in particular where they want to keep flexibility and freedom to do certain things while not doing others. And the challenge is, as it's kind of alluded in my own statement at the beginning, is where do we draw the line between those things that we want to see keep going and in fact potentially incentivize and those things that we don't. Ransomware is where potentially there shouldn't be a dilemma. The idea here is that these are private actors engaging in what is essentially the kidnapping of data and putting ransom in exchange for its release. And or now the kind of the new version of ransomware, they tell you that if you don't pay the money, they will put all that data online, making it accessible to others. And so ransomware is perhaps just a fourth generation of what international lawyers have called humanist generis. It's the idea that there are certain kinds of people out there, individuals who are engaging in crimes against mankind. Not any different than perhaps the trade slavers of old or pirates of old, or moving forward, those who kidnapped planes, or moving even further, those who engage in various forms of terrorism or transnational organized crime. In all of these prior generations, international lawyers stepped in to create treaty regimes that in certain circumstances established universal jurisdiction, required and mandated states to cooperate and share information and intelligence, and ensured that these individuals are not seen as members of society subject to the traditional protections of diplomatic protection and safe havens from their states. It is in ransomware that we have not seen these same transition moving forward. In fact, states have been reluctant to rely on legal rules to regulate this space, both domestically and internationally. Only recently, the Biden administration has called ransomware a national security threat. But even when it did so, and it went to President Putin of Russia to call him out on his safe havening of ransomware activities, he said there's should be certain kinds of ransomware activities that are off the table, listing those critical infrastructures as those for which ransomware attacks should be denied. But in so doing, he was essentially saying, but all other ransomware is fine. And that is exactly the problem. Ransomware is the kind of thing where we should have a consensus. No ransomware is fine. Why is particular kinds of targets okayed where others are not? And yet, even on something as to me obvious as that, we fail to reach international agreement and set up international norms. And I think that demonstrates beautifully just the challenges that states have had in coming together and reaching an agreement. So I'll stop here, but I think ransomware just demonstrates more of the kind of things we've been talking about so far.
Perfect. Now I'm going to turn to Dr. Watt, and I'd like to know, in your opinion, how we should be holding states accountable for internationally wrongful acts arising in the context of cyber operations, below threshold cyber operations, and what would that look like? And I do know that she has slides that she'd like to share. I think you're muted, actually, Dr. Watt.
I have to prepare the answer to this, or try to prepare answers to this by actually putting it in the form of slides, because it basically helps me to focus, and it means that I am not going to meander with my thoughts. So perhaps if we could, yes, excellent. So if you bear with me, and I will actually outline my own view in relation to this very issue. In that the issue on the state's accountability for internationally wrongful acts arising in the context of the below the threshold cyber operations, in particular highlighting certain inconsistencies in relation to both the issues of attribution and also some evidential issues, in particular the standard of care. So can I have the next slide, please? Yes, thank you. So as we have actually noted from the very start, it is very difficult to actually define with any certainty what are the below the threshold cyber operations. But in my own view, these are the operations that actually basically do not fall within Rule 69, which is set out in Italian manual, which basically states that the use of force operations are those cyber use of force operations are those operations which are akin to kinetic operations. In other words, below the threshold cyber operations don't cause significant physical damage or injury, and also they do not result in substantial permanent loss of cyber infrastructure's functionality. So when we think about the below the threshold operations in recent years, I think some of the colorful examples include what Asaf has just hinted at, a number of ransomware attacks, but also the solar wind operations are worthy of note, and the recent Pegasus spyware. May I have the next slide, please? So below threshold operations actually can give rise to the responsibility of states for wrongful acts. These are defined as a principle according to which whenever one state commits an internationally wrongful act against another, international responsibility is established between them. So therefore the question is, what is an internationally wrongful act? An internationally wrongful act is a breach of an international treaty law, customary international law, or general principles of law, and it also it has to be attributable to the state under international law. So when we think about cyber operations, this would amount to an internationally wrongful act if they are inconsistent with the primary rule of international law and when they are attributable to the state in question. May I have the next slide, please? So why is this important? So in order to make a state accountable for a damage that might have been the result of that activity, and to be able for that state to respond within the legal parameters, so what is actually within the legally established lawful responses, it is actually necessary that a particular operation is attributable or attributed to the state. So therefore, the question of attribution is a simple one. It is simple in that it is the attempt to identify the perpetrator, but obviously, in real terms, it is very, very difficult, because it is trying to assign cyber activity when a perpetrator can obviously hide its identity, or where the cyber attack originates, say, from multiple jurisdictions, or when it is conducted by a number of different players. May I have the next slide, please? And so when we think about attribution, there are three different types of attribution. We have factual or technical, political attribution, and we have legal attribution. So here, actually, for our purposes, in order to hold the state accountable for internationally wrongful acts, it is the legal attribution that matters, because legal attribution means that basically the state who has committed the wrongful act can be held responsible under international law. And also it allows us to really understand what are the sort of remedies that are available to the victim state. So this would, for example, include such things as countermeasures, the resort to countermeasures, or maybe actually also the resort to non-legal, unfriendly acts such as retortion. So can I have the next slide, please? So countermeasures are acts that otherwise would be unlawful, but for the fact that they are meant to compel another state to seize its unlawful conduct. And they are only available if the cyber operation constitutes an international wrongful act. So they would generally not be available if, in a case of an act of a proxy, which is not attributed to the state. So there would be a number of different countermeasures that a state can resort to. For example, hackbacks, so in-kind countermeasures, or not necessarily actually cyber countermeasures, such as, for example, closing of your own airspace. May I have the next slide, please? So we have already alluded to the UNGG process, and we know that there was a broad consensus reached that international law applies to cyberspace. The 2013 report actually also specifically mentioned the state responsibility principle. The 2015 GGG report then established 11 non-legally binding norms, including norm 13, which actually specifically talks about attribution, but in general terms. Can I have, yes, thank you. So then we come to the 2021 UGG report, which had actually elaborated on all of those norms, including the norm on attribution. And I think one of the most interesting aspects of that is that the report stated that the indication that the ICT activity was launched or originates from the territory of a state's infrastructure is in itself insufficient to attribute that activity to a state. Can I have the next slide, please? So obviously we know that the diplomatic process had splintered, and in parallel with the GG report, we also have the open-ended working group report, which did not actually address the problem of attribution in any way. However, obviously there might be a follow-on on this in 2025. In addition to that, as we have already noted today, numerous states have started articulating their own position in relation to how international law applies to cyber operations. And a number of them confirmed that malicious cyber operations trigger responsibility of states for internationally wrongful acts. So we have in 19 states between 2012 and 2021 that put forward their own national stance on issues of attribution. And all of them, despite the fact that these views vary, all of them actually agreed that the customary international rules on state responsibility, as articulated by the International Law Commission on state responsibility apply in this context. Can I have the next slide, please? So in general terms, the articles of state responsibility provide a duality of rules. Number one, any conduct that is wrongful, which is attributable to a state actor, would be obviously falls within the the conduct of state actors would be attributable to a state in question. Conversely, a conduct of a non-state actor would actually not be attributable to a state in question, provided unless it actually falls within one of the exceptions articulated in the articles. Can I have the next slide? So when we think about the conduct of state actors, the situation is pretty straightforward, because this would be organs which exercise legislative or executive or other function. And when we think about that being translated into the cyber domain, Tallinn Manual in Rule 15 provides more or less the same. In other words, it actually states that a conduct by a state institution or a person or organization empowered by domestic law would be attributable to a state. So it identifies such organs as intelligence agencies, military and internal security and customs agencies, which will all actually be, all of these acts would be attributable to a state. A good example would be the mass surveillance activities of the NSA and GCHQ. Can I have the next slide? And of course, more difficult is attributing a cyber operation to a non-state actor. So generally speaking, activities of non-state actors would not be attributable to states, apart from the instances set out in the articles on state responsibility. In particular, if the actor is actually acting on the instructions or under the control or direction of the state, and or when the particular action is then subsequently acknowledged by a state or adopted by it. Can I have the next slide? Thank you. So the idea of control or instruction has been then elaborated by the International Court of Justice as the effective control, and then subsequently we have also this been translated onto the cyber activities by the Tallinn Manual, which in Rule 17 actually talks about attribution of proxies, which would be established where we have non-state actors who are engaged in pursuant to states' instructions or under their direction or control, or when the state acknowledges or adopts the operation as its own. So in effect, when we think about the control of a particular cyber operation by a proxy, there seems to be a duality here. First of all, foremost, a state must, can I have the previous slide? The state must determine the execution and the course of a specific operation, and then that operation must be, the cyber operation must be an integral part of that operation. May I have the next slide? And so this is the part that actually causes some difficulties, because we have, in effect, we do not yet know in international law what is this degree of control that needs to be exercised by the state in order to attribute the action of a proxy to that state, because this degree of control seems to actually vary in sort of interpretations of the state. So I have given here 3 different examples. For example, Germany, in its 2021 policy statement, says that the degree of control must be sufficient. So there must be a sufficient degree or intensity of control. In other words, what they are saying is that the state doesn't actually have to micromanage a particular cyber activity. Definitely, it doesn't have to actually oversee every technical aspect of that operation. So this can be contrasted with the Netherlands' stance on this. And they're saying that the degree of control actually must be high, and just financing of a particular operation is not sufficient. And again, the US stance is quite obfuscated on this issue, because they are saying that where the state governs sufficient amount of information, however it is obtained, whether it's through technical means or all sorts of intelligence, that in itself permits attribution. And then that gives the right of a state to actually resort to remedies against the wrongdoer. Can I have the next slide? And of course, another issue is the issue of the burden and standard of proof. So there is a perceived understanding that it is necessary to fulfill the burden or satisfy the burden and standard of proof for two reasons. First and foremost, to determine the potential responses, including the right to resort to countermeasures. And secondly, in order then, if a state so chooses, to instigate an interstate litigation. Now, this again can be contrasted with the American view, because in accordance with the American policy stance, it is not necessary to actually satisfy the burden and standard of proof when a state resorts to countermeasures. That only becomes necessary if a state actually wants to instigate an interstate litigation, which is quite interesting, because now in law, we actually do not have an objective standard in an objective criteria, which sort of standard of proof state has to reach in order to resort to a remedy, which is a lawful remedy, which is a remedy within the parameters of law. Can I have the next stance? But that in itself actually has always been problematic, because in interstate litigation, that has never really been an established standard. So we know that in the context of cyber activities, the burden of proof actually, in accordance with the academic view, falls with the victim state, whereas the standard of proof, the view seems to be that it doesn't have to reach the beyond reasonable doubt criteria, but it is not as low as just making up of a prima facie case, but it sort of lies in the middle. In other words, it either has to be high or intermediate, based on convincing evidence or the preponderance of evidence. And finally, in addition, a state considering taking countermeasures must act as a reasonable state would act under the circumstances. So can I have the final slide? So all in all, in answer to how a state would be held responsible for internationally wrongful act in the context of below the threshold operations, obviously the operation must first be attributed to the state in question. So attribution here would be to a state organ or a proxy where such operations are engaged in pursuance to state's instructions or under state direction or control. However, obviously, we don't know what is the necessary degree of control. It could be high. It should be high in accordance with the views of some states. It should be sufficient in the view of others. And or where a state later acknowledges or adopts the operation of its own. In addition, the general view is that to resort to countermeasures and or for the purposes of interstate litigation, a state must also satisfy the burden and standard of proof. Here, it seems that the burden of proof still lies with the state in question, and the standard of proof is either high or it's intermediate based on convincing evidence or its preponderance. So I hope that this answers the question that I was asked to deal with. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Watt. And I think you raised some really excellent points. I think we're all becoming used to seeing states attribute attacks to different states. We've even had NATO, for example, attribute an attack to China. But what you don't see in those statements is A, what the evidence is to support the attribution, and you almost never see what legal principle or law has been violated in those statements. Realistically, you see a statement that says this action, which is bad, but they never point to a legal rule that's been violated. So this action was perpetrated by such and such state. No evidence and why we think this is bad. Right? That's ultimately what you're getting. So you're getting the political level of attribution that Dr. Watt mentions, but you're not getting the technical nor the legal attribution in those statements. So I'll just turn now to everyone and ask, given everything that we've talked about here, all of the different struggles, dilemmas, or the slowness of developing these things, well, the exceptional has become the everyday. Is this concept of below threshold, or as we talk about it in popular culture, gray space, is this concept really even helpful when we're talking about the law and regulations? If yes, do you see a way forward using these concepts, or if not, do you see a different way of classifying what we're talking about so that we might be able to move forward and proceed with some sort of legal regulation or norm building? So I'm just going to go in order that we talked today and ask Professor Lubin to jump in.
Yeah, I think it is helpful in drawing a line between whatever it is that we're talking about and those things that have been regulated. And I do think that we can draw inspiration from the regulations of those things that have been regulated, the above the threshold space, where there are a huge amount of categories, from use of force to those armed attacks to trigger self-defensive action, to acts of aggression, to armed conflict, and the various categorizations within armed conflict. So there is a lot of these category building exercises happening in the above the threshold space. And what we failed to do is, in part because states were reluctant to do it up until now, is do the same kind of exercises in the below the threshold space, in distinguishing between the lawful and unlawful acts of intervention that states commonly engaging in diplomatic life, in distinguishing between what Professor Delerue called one leg is okay, but two legs in your territory is not okay for a sovereignty violation, right? In kind of setting the lines for sovereignty intervention space and trying to regulate it. And I would just argue, because that's my passion in life, the one particular reason why we've been reluctant to do so is because of the intersectionality between espionage and all of this. States have been reluctant to set legal rules or even norms that apply to intelligence operations for many years and prefer to treat it as an extra legal construct. But the reality is, because of the daily exchanges that Professor Delerue was describing, we're now in a universe where you cannot not address the espionage space and setting some rules of the road for it, because the result is that so many of these cyber activities are treading the lines of intelligence collection or require certain kinds of unauthorized access as a first step, which is the very definition of what the first step of an intelligence operation is too. And so the result is that we have the list of below the threshold activities that Dr. Watt alluded to. Say NSO group was on her list. So is NSO group lawful or unlawful under international law? The privatization of intelligence activities and the trade in surveillance tech solutions. We have failed to set rules of the norms for that. And I think that now is prime time to do so. And I will just shamelessly plug my forthcoming book with Oxford University Press, where I try to propose precisely that what that international legal framework could look like.
And I'm very excited for it. Professor Delerue.
So yeah, the distinction between above and below the threshold, let's say, is kind of the historical and even like the real summa division of international law. I am in The Hague now, 10 kilometers from here. We have the city where Grotius was born, and he is the father of this kind of like big division between war and peace and how it affects international law. I think it's still relevant today to have the distinction, because we are talking about really two different type of situation. In above the threshold, and as Professor Lubin just mentioned, we have really this distinction between, on the one side, use of force, how the force is regulated, and then we have the law of armed conflict. And I think it's mainly useful for the law of armed conflict. This needs to not be conflated with the rest. And this is a very specific law because it has a very specific philosophy, a very specific objective. So I think that's why also there is this need. Then if we move below the threshold, I think it's maybe the wrong approach to see it as a block. So kind of opposing above and below the threshold. And a bit what was said before in the two presentations, it's much more gray on what we have below the threshold. And I think this is where we need to reflect a bit more. Part of the difficulty, I would say, and why we have this kind of summa divisions that still apply is also because what we see with cyber, and I could have mentioned that in the question you asked me, and the difference is, in the past, when you had a question above the threshold, it will be always a military question going to the lawyer of the Ministry of Defense or whatever structure you have in your state, coordination with MFA, with Foreign Affairs, maybe head of state. But that will be how this will be dealt with. Below the threshold, mainly like taking countermeasure, will be more a treasury question, will be a question dealt by economical part of the government, not by military parts, not by other parts. And I think it's where it becomes a bit blurred with cyber, because we are asking lawyers that were used to work on a specific question, specific set of questions. Now you have to deal with the full spectrum of international law, moving from how do you react to a self-defense question to how you react to a very low intensity violation of sovereignty, taking the form of penetrating into a few computers and maybe stealing a few data or just watching a few data. So I think that's where there is a difficulty. We kind of find some comfort in sticking to the SUMA division of below and above the threshold, but I think this maybe need to evolve in the future on the way we see it. So that would be my first answer. On one of the question, on this question, on the way forward, on this question, we see it, I think, in what I was saying before, I was kind of criticizing this idea of struggle. There is a struggle. We don't know what the law applies. What I wanted to say is just we may need a bit more time, a bit more practice, and we should not overestimate the fact that these things take time. Still, there are some questions, and I think there are some important questions we need to work on. One of the elements I wanted to put here on one of the questions for me, which is very important, and we need to answer, which I lost in my notes, it's fine, sorry. It's the question of, we need to address what do we want to achieve at the international level. And that remains for me one of the big questions regarding how we talk about international law, how we talk about below or above the threshold, but mainly below the threshold. Because we cannot really move forward with that, and maybe the international communities, the states will not move forward if they don't know what they want to achieve, and then questioning subsequently, where do you want to go with international law? How international law can address that? How do you want to move? I think the point made by Professor Lubin on ransomware is an important point, and maybe there is a red line to be drawn. There you can maybe identify that the law as it exists does not provide answers, and maybe you need to move or you need to have an adaptation. But you need first to take this step of deciding that's where we want to go. And that's where you may need an evolution. Because if we continue to have just a discussion, international law and cyber, we kind of, I think, have solved in a lot of ways that in general, it applies, it offers answers and so forth. Then we need to identify this kind of question. I think another one, which was very interesting in Dr. Watt's presentation, is all this question of attribution. As I said in my introductory remarks, the law kind of provides the categories, and we have kind of an answer to attribution. But then there may be specific question where there is a problem. And for example, in the book you mentioned at the beginning, one of the things I show is the case of Estonia or the case of DDoS attacks, which is a big question. You have this type of attacks where you will have multiple number of actors targeting at the same time a target, and they may have been incentivized by a state, but that doesn't mean that they are controlled by that state. So whatever proofs you may bring on the table, whatever you want to show, you will be able to identify they have been incentivized by a state, but that's not a category in terms of attribution. So here, the law as it is will not bring an answer. Either we evolve in the law, and there is something with incentivization. I would be against that, because I think then you'll be over kind of apply attribution, but still, that may be the question we need to address. And the question is not attribution doesn't work, it's the situation that we see is different. And this is not a cyber question. This is also a question outside of cyber. And we have endless debates about several cases lately where we saw people taking up arms, going abroad, either in Syria, either in Ukraine, elsewhere, and fighting against the state. But they have not been sent by a state or controlled by a state. They're acting on their own, incentivized by different actors, maybe state, maybe other actors. But that's not something that existing international can address, I would say.
Perfect, thank you. Dr. Watt.
So yes, I think first and foremost, to my own mind, distinguishing between the above and the below threshold operations is absolute necessity. I think a good example of that it was the response of certain US officials in the context of SolarWinds operations, where these operations were actually called acts of war or acts of armed conflict, when in effect, under strict international law interpretation, actually they cannot be so. So I think first and foremost there has to be some sort of clear differentiation between the below and the above use of force threshold operations. But number two, I think within the below threshold operations, that in itself actually now requires a far more nuanced gradation than what we have been used to. So let's think about the intelligence gathering operations in cyberspace as an example. So we obviously normally actually attach the language of espionage to this sort of operations, where I have been for a while now convinced that, again, although this nomenclature is actually not wrong in its own right, I think for the future purposes, or for the purposes of some sort of attempting to grapple as an international community with those sort of issues, we again need to start legally actually adopting a far more nuanced taxonomy to these operations. So to me, it seems that activities, cyber espionage activities or intelligence gathering activities actually would perhaps require a sort of a differentiation between cyber espionage activities which target particular groups, such as, for example, the Pegasus project, or cyber surveillance activities. So these are activities which actually then are conducted on a larger scale, where vast number of people are being intercepted on quite regular basis. And then we have also this idea of what is bulk interception of communications, which again is undefined, and yet seems to be, in particular in Europe, has been accepted by certain governments and also by courts. So in effect, all of that actually needs to be somehow agreed upon. And of course, another point is actually how do we classify electoral interference campaigns? Are these acts of espionage? Are these acts of intervention into, say, sovereignty of states? Are they acts that actually coerce a state to actually making certain choices which they don't necessarily want to make? So, in effect, what is required is a finer understanding of what these operations are. What sort of purpose would that serve? Would that mean that actually regulating these activities is going to be easier? I honestly don't know. So, for example, if I am thinking of regulating of surveillance activities, so this has been on the cards since approximately 2015, both in Europe and actually within the United Nations, and these attempts have failed. So I think it's very much down to, obviously us understanding what is going on as lawyers in order to then perhaps serve for this sort of nomenclature to be adopted, especially when political attribution is made by state officials for those sort of purposes. But whether this would actually serve a useful purpose in relation to regulating of those activities, I just don't know, because on number of occasions, these attempts have been made, and we don't have, say, a cybersecurity treaty yet. We don't have a cyber surveillance treaty which regulates the working methods of state intelligence agencies. We have reluctance of states to actually subject cyber espionage or cyber intelligence gatherings full stop to any form of regulation. So I think distinguishing among these different activities is very helpful, but it's only as far as we as lawyers can actually go. Obviously, the rest is down to the willingness of the states to subject these operations to any form of regulation. So I think I would say yes, but by the way things are going, it seems as though this is going to be an incremental process of soft law development, norm development, and that sort of thing.
Thank you. I think you raise an interesting point. What would finally incentivize states to actually take these steps to regulate these activities? And if there is any kind of activity that would relate to this, I mean, typically we think of Great Wars as a way of incentivizing states to take action, but when we're talking about espionage and below threshold operations, is there anything that could incentivize states to come to the table to regulate their surveillance activities? So I'm just going to leave it there because I see I'm being hovered over. Thank you so much to all of you for a fantastic conversation, and hopefully we've set up the next panel nicely. I really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you to Dr. Lea West and the collection of legal experts from abroad for their time today. We really appreciate your expertise on this matter. This is the end of the first panel. The second panel begins in 15 minutes. We have a 15-minute health break. Please take advantage of the food and drinks we have available to us. And I'll talk to Rachel about setting up the next panel, as the next three panelists are also coming from abroad, two from Europe and one from the United States. So thank you very much. And for those online, we'll be back in about 15 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you.